Prisoners looking to entertain themselves often tell stories, some true and some fabricated. It was the latter that resulted in the massacre of a family in rural Kansas in the fall of 1959. The two men involved in this tragedy were Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. In 1958, Dick was imprisoned at the state penitentiary in Lansing, Kansas, for burglary. In early 1959, Perry, who was serving time for stealing office equipment, became Dick's cellmate. Despite their differences, the two men formed enough of a bond that once both were released, they planned and executed one of the worst crimes of the mid-20th century. Richard Hickok was born in Kansas City on June 6, 1931, to parents Walter Sr. and Eunice Hickok. His life was mostly unremarkable until 1950, when he was involved in a serious car accident. While assisting at his father's auto shop, he was tasked with picking up parts in Olathe, a small town near Kansas City. During the drive, he encountered a patch of water on the highway, causing him to lose control of the car. As a result, the vehicle rolled, and he was ejected into a ditch. In the aftermath of the accident, Dick sustained head injuries that caused his face to appear slightly lopsided and his eyes to be asymmetrical. Additionally, he suffered a minor brain injury that affected his personality. Once a popular student in high school, he became introverted and hot-tempered, eventually leading him to a life of petty crime. The law eventually caught up to Dick, and on March 15, 1958, he was sentenced to a 5-year stretch in the Lansing State Penitentiary in Kansas for stealing a rifle. It was during his time there that he would eventually meet Perry. Unlike Dick, Perry Smith had anything but an ordinary life. He was born on October 27, 1928, to an Irish descendant father and a Native American mother, and his childhood was marked by instability and tragedy. Perry's parents, Tex and Flo, were both rodeo performers until 1929, when Tex was forced to retire due to work-related injuries. The family then moved to Juneau, Alaska, where Tex made a living by distilling bootleg whiskey. Unhappy with his new life, Tex drank excessively and became an abusive husband and father. Finally, in 1935, Flo left him, taking their 4 children with her to San Francisco, California. In the years that followed, Flo struggled with alcohol abuse, and tragically, she died in 1941 after choking on her own vomit. After her death, Perry was placed in an orphanage, where he began to experience frequent and uncontrollable outbursts of anger, often getting into heated confrontations and fights. In an effort to address his struggles with anger, Perry joined the Merchant Marines at the age of 16. He later continued his service by enlisting in the U.S. Army, where he served during the Korean War. After leaving the Army in 1952, he settled in the Tacoma area, where he lived with a fellow soldier and worked as a car painter. At some point, Perry rented a motorcycle, and while on a drive, the bike skidded out of control when he hit a sandy patch on the road. As a result, he shattered his left leg, broke his hip and left arm, and spent a year in the hospital. After his release, Perry began a nomadic lifestyle, traveling throughout the country and taking on various jobs. Eventually, he met a fellow drifter, and the two of them engaged in a series of petty crimes. Perry was ultimately arrested in 1956 for stealing office equipment in Phillipsburg, a small town in Kansas, and was sentenced to 5 to 10 years at the state penitentiary in Lansing. It was early 1959 when Dick Hickok first met Perry Smith, and despite their differences, they formed some semblance of a friendship. At first, Dick didn't think much of Perry or what he had to say. However, one day Perry shared a story that significantly changed Dick's opinion of him. Perry told him about a man of color he knew in Nevada. He said the man's name was King, and that he lived in the same rundown boarding house in Las Vegas that he did. He told Dick one summer evening a few years back, he invited King to go for a drive and enjoy a few beers together. Once they were out in the desert, he beat the man to death with a chain just to see what it was like. After that, he left him there and drove back to Las Vegas. After hearing the story, Dick decided at that moment that Perry was the person he wanted as a partner in his quest for the perfect score. He now saw him as a natural-born killer, and in his opinion, they were rare. What Dick didn't know was that the story wasn't true, or at least the killing part wasn't. Perry did, in fact, meet King at a boarding house in Las Vegas, and, as far as he knew, King was still very much alive. In July of 1959, Perry Smith was released from prison, and as part of his parole conditions, he immediately left Kansas. Dick's release would soon follow, but not before he heard a story from his new cellmate that would set in motion a tragedy that would forever destroy the notion of tranquility in small-town America. The tale, recounted by Floyd Wells, who was serving 3 to 5 years for stealing a lawnmower, revolved around his time working for Herbert W. Clutter, the owner of River Valley Farm in Holcomb, Kansas. Floyd recalled an incident when he was with Mr. Clutter as he paid a hefty lumber bill for a house he was building. Herb had remarked that he had paid out more than $10,000 that day. He then confided to Dick that Mr. Clutter had a safe in his office, located right behind his desk, where he kept all his cash. However, Floyd knew this part was untrue, as Mr. Clutter used checks to pay for everything, including Floyd's wages, but it made for a better story. From that day until Dick's release, the Clutters were all he wanted to talk about. Dick grilled Floyd for more details, wanting to know every aspect of the farm, including who lived there and the exact layout of the house. Dick also bragged to Floyd about his former cellmate Perry and emphasized how he was a natural-born killer. He said that once he was out, he and Perry would drive to Holcomb to get those $10,000, and they would leave no witnesses. On August 13, 1959, while Floyd Wells was resting on his bunk bed listening to his portable radio, Dick was being released from prison. The terms of Dick's parole required that he must reside at a fixed address and hold down a job. Upon his release, he moved into his parents' home and secured employment as an auto mechanic at Bob Sands' body shop. Over the next couple of months, Dick kept his head down and maintained the conditions of his parole. Then, sometime near the end of October 1959, he decided it was time to carry out his plan to rob the River Valley Farm. On the same day he made this decision, he sat at his small desk in his room and wrote a letter to Perry Smith. Just over 400 miles away, in the small community of Holcomb, Kansas, the morning of November 14th began like any other Saturday for Herb Clutter. He woke up early, and it took him little time to get out the door to do the daily chores. He was 48 years old, in good health according to his doctor, and owned 880 acres of land. Herb was highly regarded in his community as one of the most successful wheat farmers. He was a leader both in his church and his field of agriculture, winning many accolades. He married Bonnie Fox in 1934, and together they had 4 children, 3 of whom were daughters and 1 son. The oldest daughter, Eviana, was married and living in Illinois, and the second oldest, Beverly, was living in Kansas City, studying to be a nurse. She was also engaged to be married during the Christmas holidays. Nancy, who was Herb and Bonnie's 3rd daughter and 3rd oldest, was still living at home, as was her younger brother Kenyon. Bonnie was also awake and soon got up to begin preparing breakfast. Lately, she hadn't been sleeping well, as she was focused on planning the upcoming family reunion scheduled for Thanksgiving. She had wanted to organize this special event for the past few years and was truly looking forward to making it memorable and successful. In addition, she was also helping to prepare for Beverly's upcoming wedding during the Christmas holidays. While she was excited about these events, she also looked forward to the new year when things would return to normal. Nancy woke up about the same time as her parents but lingered in bed while going over her plans for the day. At 16, she led a very active life. Sometimes she would even rival her father's busy schedule. In addition to being a straight-A student, she taught Sunday school, was a leader in the 4-H club, and was involved in the drama club at her school. Nancy also managed to juggle a packed social calendar. She maintained many close friendships and even found time to date a local boy. Her most cherished time, though, was riding her horse Babe through the fields of their large spread. As Nancy was heading downstairs to help her mom with breakfast, Kenyon was just waking up. He was just a year younger than his sister, but they were nothing alike. He had always been a bit of a loner, and after losing his best friend to a girl, he had to continue the many projects they had been working on alone. One of his favorite ways to pass the time was tinkering with an old truck that his father had let him buy when he was 11. He was always good with his hands, and one of his many talents was working with wood. His latest project was a mahogany hope chest for his sister Beverly's upcoming wedding. The only thing left to do before it was complete was to apply a final coat of varnish, which he planned to do later that morning. On that Saturday, sometime after 8 a.m., the Clutter family sat around the table, sharing what would be their last breakfast together. Meanwhile, back in Olathe, Perry was up early on that same Saturday morning, but it was the pain in his leg that woke him. Ever since the bike accident, his leg had never fully recovered, and he had to rely on continuous use of aspirin to manage the discomfort. Perry arrived in Kansas City a few days earlier and was staying at a hotel in Olathe. When he received Dick's letter while working in Buell, Idaho, he was uncertain about wanting anything to do with him and his big score. However, for reasons he never fully understood, he found himself on a Greyhound bus heading to Kansas City. After dragging himself out of bed, Perry downed a few aspirin and headed to the cafe across the street and waited for Dick. Before leaving to pick up Perry, Dick told his mom the story that he and Perry had planned the night before. He explained that they would be driving to Fort Scott to visit Perry's sister and that they wouldn't return until the next day. Afterward, Dick snuck the shotgun out of the house and placed it in the trunk of his black 1955 Chevy. He then grabbed a hunting knife, some leather gloves, and a hunting vest filled with shotgun shells. With that done, Dick made the 10-minute drive to Olathe, where he picked up Perry at the Jewel Cafe. Before leaving town, they first stopped at Bob Sand's body shop, where Dick worked. To avoid any breakdowns on their trip, they gave the Chevy a quick tune-up and swapped out the tires for ones in better condition. By the time they hit the road, it was just after 1 on a cool Saturday afternoon. Along the way, they stopped at Emporia and picked up rope, had a meal in Great Bend, and then, after 10 hours of driving, they entered Garden City. With a population of 11,000 residents, it would be the last city before reaching Holcomb, so they stopped at a Phillips 66 and filled their depleted gas tank. From there, they drove the final 7 miles to the River Valley Farm. Once they reached the turnoff to the driveway, Dick switched off the car's lights. The moon was hanging full in the night sky, giving them all the light they needed. After they drove partway down the driveway, Dick pulled the car over under a tree so they could scope out the house. After sitting there for a few minutes, a light turned on in the house, situated a few hundred feet to the right of the primary residence. Recalling the map he'd drawn earlier, Dick recognized it as the hired hand's dwelling. As Dick and Perry were pondering their options, the light went off. After waiting a while and with everything remaining dark, they grabbed the weapons along with the flashlight and made their way to the Clutter house. Dick led the way carrying the flashlight and the knife, and Perry was close behind, packing the shotgun. In the close-knit community of Holcomb, Kansas, like much of rural America during the mid-20th century, few people locked their doors. This was the case for the Clutter home, where Dick and Perry entered the unlocked house directly into Herb's office. Convinced that this was a sign of good luck, the two men started searching the room for the safe. However, their hopes quickly faded when they couldn't find one. Refusing to give up, they first woke Herb Clutter, followed by his wife Bonnie, and finally their children, Nancy and Kenyon. After questioning the frightened family about the location of the safe and not getting the answers they wanted, Perry locked them in the bathroom while Dick searched the house. However, it didn't take long for him to realize there was no safe and very little cash. Next, the intruders removed the family members from the bathroom one by one, binding them and taping their mouths shut. Herb and Kenyon were taken to the basement, where Mr. Clutter was tied up on the floor near the furnace, while Kenyon was secured to a sofa in a nearby playroom. Back upstairs, Bonnie and Nancy were then taken to their bedrooms, where their hands and feet were bound together behind their backs. When the men returned to the basement, Perry pulled Dick aside so they were out of earshot of the two Clutter men and suggested that they should just leave. However, Dick was adamant about not leaving any witnesses. Perry, angry with both himself and Dick for being in this situation, handed the shotgun to Dick, and goaded him to use it, but Dick refused. As the tension continued to rise, Perry taunted Dick further, reminding him that he was the one who had repeatedly said they would leave no witnesses, and now he couldn't even follow through with his own plan. In a blind rage, Perry took the knife, walked over to Herb Clutter, and pressed the blade against his neck. With his eyes fixed on his partner, he cut deep into Herb's throat. It took Perry a few seconds before he realized what he had done. When he finally looked down, he could see the blood soaking into the cardboard on which Herb was lying. He could also see that Herb was drowning in his own blood, so he quickly grabbed the shotgun from Dick, pointed it at Herb's head, and pulled the trigger. The sound was immediate and explosive, accompanied by a brilliant blue flash emanating from the shotgun's barrel. Without wasting another second, Perry walked into the room where Kenyon was, and there was another deafening explosion as he pulled the trigger at point-blank range. The two killers then went up to the second-floor bedrooms and dealt the same fate to both Bonnie and Nancy Clutter. After collecting the spent shotgun shells, Dick and Perry returned to their vehicle and began the drive back to Olathe. Their total haul included a Zenith portable radio, a pair of binoculars, and approximately $40 in cash. In addition to the tragic loss of 4 lives and a devastated family and community, the killers left behind 2 distinct boot prints, just inches from Herb Clutter's body. On Sunday, November 15th, at just past 9 a.m., the bodies of the Clutter family were discovered. 2 of Nancy's friends had arrived at the Clutter home to pick her up for church. When no one answered the door, the girls entered the house, went up the stairs to Nancy's bedroom, and made the gruesome discovery of their murdered friend. At around 10 a.m., Sheriff Robinson arrived at the house. After conducting a preliminary search, he quickly realized that the crime scene was beyond the capabilities of his department. He then promptly called the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, reaching out specifically to Alvin Dewey, the former sheriff of Finney County. When Dewey arrived and assessed the scene, he took on the role of lead agent and was soon joined by 3 additional KBI agents. By noon, the house was crowded with personnel, including the sheriff, KBI agents, the coroner, a Methodist minister, and a police photographer. By the end of the second day, the KBI had gathered the little evidence there was and interviewed many of the Clutter family friends, but the case was at a standstill. Given the brutal nature of the murders, one working theory suggested a possible personal vendetta against one or more members of the Clutter family. However, it was soon determined that this theory lacked credibility. The only physical evidence found at the scene consisted of 2 distinct boot prints. One featured a cat's paw design, while the other had a diamond tread pattern. It wouldn't be until 3 weeks after the murders of the Clutter family that the KBI would finally receive a break in the case. Dick and Perry spent about a week in Olathe before deciding to drive to Mexico. Upon their arrival, they sold the car, as well as the portable radio and binoculars they had taken from the Clutter home. After spending a few days in Mexico City, they traveled to Acapulco. However, by mid-December, they had very little money left and decided to return to the United States. Since they no longer had a car, they shipped most of their belongings to Las Vegas, their eventual destination. Among the items in one of the boxes were 2 pairs of boots. One featured a cat's paw design, while the other had a diamond tread pattern. On Tuesday, December 15th, the 2 men boarded a bus heading to Barstow, California. Meanwhile, back in Kansas, the KBI finally connected Dick and Perry to the Clutter family murders and began their search for the 2 men. The breakthrough in the case occurred on December 5th, but for reasons unknown, the authorities did not act on it until the 9th. The tip that led to this connection came from Floyd Wells, Dick's former cellmate. The day after the murders, Floyd was listening to his portable radio when a news bulletin reported the brutal slayings of the Clutter family. He knew right away it was Dick since, during their time together, he had bragged about how he and Perry were going to rob the Clutters and leave no witnesses. Floyd had a story, but he also had concerns about telling it. If the other prisoners found out he was a rat, it wouldn't end well for him. Additionally, he worried that the authorities might suspect he was also involved in the crime. However, when he heard about a reward of $1,000 for information regarding the murders, he finally reached out. By the end of December, Dick and Perry had arrived in Las Vegas. Along the way, they hot-wired a '56 Chevy and eventually made their way back to Kansas City. After spending a few days writing bad checks, they drove to Florida, where they spent Christmas. The two men then continued their travels through the southern states, where they ultimately ended up in Vegas. On December 29th, Dick and Perry parked in front of the post office to pick up the belongings they'd had shipped from Mexico. While they were inside the building, two police officers on patrol noticed a black '56 Chevy with Kansas plates. When the officers checked with dispatch, they confirmed the car was connected to the fugitives Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. The officers then waited for the two men to return to the car, arrested them, and confiscated their belongings. Among the items found in the mailed boxes were the same two pairs of boots Dick and Perry wore while committing the Clutter family murders. The news of their arrest was quickly communicated to Agent Al Dewey, who, along with his team, made the trip to Las Vegas. After the agents arrived, they separated Perry and Dick for questioning. When interviewing Perry, he refused to cooperate, so the agents decided to focus on Dick, who seemed more talkative. Initially, they kept the conversation light, implying he was only arrested for stealing a car and writing a few bad checks. However, as the interview progressed, the agents altered their tone when they brought up the Clutter murders. They then asked Dick where he and Perry were on the early morning of November 14th. Dick claimed they were in Fort Smith visiting Perry's sister, but Agent Nye revealed this was a lie since they had already spoken to her. Then the agents presented a crucial piece of evidence, a photograph showing boot prints next to Herb Clutter's body. When Agent Nye placed Dick and Perry's boots next to the photo, which showed an exact match, Dick confessed. He told the agents that he had no idea Perry was going to kill the Clutters. His only intention was to rob them. With that, Agent Nye gave Dick a pen and some paper, instructing him to write it all down and sign it. In early January of 1960, Dick and Perry were escorted out of the jail in Las Vegas and placed into two separate cars for transportation to Garden City, Kansas. Two agents accompanied Dick in the lead car, while Agent Dewey rode with Perry in the following car. On the drive back to Kansas, Perry finally confessed to the events of the early morning of November 14th after realizing that Dick had talked. Unlike his partner, Perry admitted to his role in the murders, telling Agent Dewey that he killed Herb and Kenyon Clutter. However, he stated that it was Dick who shot Bonnie and Nancy. Once they arrived in Garden City, both Dick and Perry were placed in separate cells to await their first court appearance. The trial between the state of Kansas and Richard Eugene Hickok and Perry Edward Smith began at 10 a.m. on March 22, 1960. Given the confessions and physical evidence presented, there was little doubt regarding the guilt of the two men. The main focus of the trial was determining whether they should be sentenced to hang for the murders. After the prosecution spent 4 days presenting evidence, the defense relied on their only strategy: to convince the jury that both men were not in their right minds at the time of the murders. However, the judge allowed little leeway for this defense. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for only 30 minutes before convicting both men to hang for the murders of Herb, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter. On April 14, 1965, after 5 years of appeals, both men were executed by hanging. Dick was the first to be escorted to the gallows. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Dick nodded and said, "I just want to say I hold no hard feelings. You people are sending me to a better world than this ever was." 20 minutes after the trapdoor opened, the doctor pronounced Dick Hickok dead. Next, Perry was led up to the gallows. When it was time for him to deliver his last words, he said, "I think it's a hell of a thing that a life has to be taken in this manner. Any apologies for what I have done would be meaningless at this time. I don't have any animosities to anyone involved in this matter. I think that is all." The trapdoor opened at 1:02 in the morning, and the prison physician pronounced Perry Smith dead at 1:19 a.m. on April 14, 1965.
You understand that this can be used against you?
Yes. So now here's the thing, something like this. Is there any way I can get out on a manslaughter charge? Because I never pulled the trigger. In fact, I didn't even know what the goddamn hell was going on. I was in the other room when it first happened.
Of course, that'll have to be worked out with the county attorney, Dick. I couldn't tell you
Because
that.
I hate signing the confession, you know.
This is the true picture of what happened out there. This is your story of what happened out there. You do whatever you want.
That's just a suggestion.
Well, what's the name of this family out there?
Herbert Clutter.
Herbert Clutter. Who was with you?
Perry Smith.
But there wasn't to be any killing.
That's for damn sure. But supposed to be done no time. He'll probably deny shooting. How you going to prove the difference?
Well, you know it's a trick thing.
Yeah, but if I get the rope and you don't, that is going to help us.